The bow touched the strings, and by the third note, the room that had once roared with laughter fell into stunned silence. From a dusty, broken violin came a sound so haunting, so pure, it made even the proudest judges sit forward in disbelief. In that moment, Amara Sinclair, mocked, dismissed, and nearly forgotten, held every soul in the auditorium captive. The marble floors of Belhust Conservatory gleamed like ice under the chandelier lights. Everything about the grand audition hall radiated wealth and tradition. Thick velvet curtains draped the stage, gilded wall sconces flickered with warm light, and the air buzzed with nervous ambition. Seated in neat rows were young men and women in tailored suits and elegant dresses, instruments polished to perfection. This was the International Virtuoso Showcase audition, the most important day of the year for Belhust's elite music students. Winning meant international tours, agents, fame. Losing meant fading quietly into practice rooms and forgotten hallways. Nobody came here to be invisible. And yet, through the massive oak doors at the back of the auditorium, someone almost invisible stepped in. She didn't walk like the others, chins raised, shoulders squared, steps sharp with practiced confidence. She moved with quiet purpose, not trying to take up space. She didn't wear black stilettos or designer flats. Just faded canvas shoes with scuffed toes. Her jeans were loose at the ankles, her denim shirt wrinkled from long travel, and slung over her shoulder was an old violin case, covered in flannel cloth frayed at the corners. Her name was Amara Sinclair. 21. African American. A soft-spoken girl from the east side of Detroit whose life had been marked more by subway echoes and second-hand scores than concert halls. The laughter started the moment she stepped inside. Subtle at first, snickers from the middle rows, a few whispered jokes passed between competitors. But it didn't stay quiet. Brandon Langston, the poster boy of Belhust, lounged in the front row with his violin propped against his leg like a trophy. He wore a blazer that probably cost more than Amara's entire month of rent. His hair was slicked back, his smile smug. He turned to his friend, a flutist named Rachel with eyes sharp as glass. "Did janitorial staff get lost?" he said loudly. "Or is this the conservatory's charity outreach program?" Rachel giggled, flipping her long, honey-colored hair over one shoulder. "Maybe she thinks this is America's Got Talent." That made the row behind them erupt in laughter. One girl clapped mockingly. Another whispered, "Does that case even have a real instrument in it?" Amara kept walking. Her eyes didn't scan for an empty seat. She already knew what they thought of her. This wasn't her first time being misjudged. She just lowered her head slightly, not in shame, but in restraint. She took a seat in the last row, away from the polished crowd. Her violin sat at her feet like a secret. Up on the judges' platform, Professor Vivian Kessler crossed her legs and leaned toward Dr. Thomas Wexler. Kessler was infamous at Belhust, impeccable, ruthless, a former concert soloist turned gatekeeper. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That one in the back," she murmured, her sharp eyes on Amara. Bold of her to think those Goodwill rags belong under stage lights. Wexler chuckled under his breath. "What's next? Someone showing up barefoot?" When they called Amara's name an hour later, silence stretched thin across the room. A few students blinked in confusion. She hadn't spoken, hadn't played a warm-up scale, hadn't mingled with the others. Brandon called out, mockernist, "Well now, let's not be elitist. Give her a shot. We could all use a little entertainment." Professor Kessler raised a brow. "Mr. Langston," she said with false sweetness, "why don't you fetch our guest an instrument?" Brandon grinned and walked to the side of the room where spare instruments were stored. He returned with a dusty, neglected violin, the kind reserved for emergencies and beginners. He held it out with a flourish. "Your Stradivarius, madam." The room chuckled again. Amara rose. Her face betrayed no emotion. She accepted the violin, her hands moving over the worn wood with a gentle familiarity that nobody noticed. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She walked to the stage and stepped into the spotlight, her canvas shoes squeaking softly against the hardwood. From the wings, someone imitated the screech of a bad violinist. More laughter. Someone else muttered, "Watch her break a string just trying to tune." She stood center stage. The dusty instrument hung from her shoulder, barely gleaming under the light. She adjusted the pegs, her fingers moving with the ease of muscle memory. Then came the bow, short strokes, testing friction, coaxing the strings into harmony. A hush fell, not reverent, but mocking. The kind of silence that says, "Let's watch her fail." Amara didn't flinch. Then she began to play. The first note sliced through the room, soft, precise, vibrating with clarity that made people glance up. The second wrapped around it, warmer, deeper. And then she let go. Sarasate's Zigeunerweisen flooded the hall. Passionate, bold, sharp-edged. The piece was wild, full of fire and ghost-like passages, and she moved through it as if possessed. Her bow arced through the air like a sword. Her fingers danced across the fingerboard without hesitation. This wasn't the work of someone who'd watched tutorials on YouTube or fumbled with borrowed instruments. This was mastery, painfully earned, deeply felt. By the time she reached the harmonic glissandos, no one laughed. Brandon's smile had disappeared. Rachel's flute slipped from her lap. Even Professor Kessler leaned forward, lips parted, eyes narrowed, not in disdain anymore, but disbelief. Dr. Wexler's hand trembled as he scribbled notes he'd soon forget he wrote. Amara's body swayed gently with the music, but her face remained serene. She didn't close her eyes for effect. She didn't need to. She wasn't performing for them. She was channeling something older than applause. When the last note dissolved into silence, it left the room breathless. Then the clapping began. Not polite. Not hesitant. Roaring. People stood, their hands raw, their voices rising with cheers. A few students looked embarrassed, not just by their mockery, but by their inability to come close to what they'd just heard. Amara lowered the violin, her arms steady, her expression unchanged. She didn't bow. She didn't need to. She simply stood, still and silent, the battered violin resting in her hands like a relic. Professor Kessler stood abruptly. "Miss Sinclair," she said, her voice forced into formality, trying to recover control. What training have you had?" Amara met her eyes evenly. "I was Maestro William Dupree's last student," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. Gasps echoed. Wexler dropped his pen. William Dupree, the legendary black violinist whose interpretations of Brahms and Bartók had redefined modern playing, had vanished from public life nearly 5 years ago. He was said to have refused students, too exacting for mentorship. The idea that this quiet girl had studied with him was unthinkable. Until now. The silence returned. Heavier. Awestruck. Professor Kessler cleared her throat. You've honored his memory today." Amara nodded once. But she didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because in this hall of privilege and performance, she had spoken the loudest, not with words, but with music. And they had heard her. Whether they wanted to or not. The applause still echoed in the rafters when Amara Sinclair finally lowered the violin. Her arms remained steady, her breath calm, but the hall was anything but. A moment ago, they'd laughed. A moment ago, she'd been a joke with dusty shoes and a borrowed instrument. Now, no one could look away. Eyes followed her every breath. Even Professor Kessler, the formidable gatekeeper of Belhust, looked unsettled, her manicured fingers drumming nervously against the velvet of her armrest. Amara didn't bow. She didn't soak in the awe. She simply stood there, quiet and composed, as if what she had just done was inevitable. As if she knew exactly how it would end the moment the bow touched the strings. The head of the panel, Dr. Thomas Wexler, a silver-haired cellist known for never showing emotion during auditions, was the first to speak. "Miss Sinclair," his voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "That was extraordinary. May I ask, where did you train?" There was a beat of silence. Then Amara spoke, her voice low but unwavering. carrying easily across the stunned room. I was Maestro William Dupree's last student. The reaction was instant. A collective gasp, audible and sharp, moved through the audience like a gust of wind. Several students shifted in their seats. A girl in the second row clapped her hand over her mouth. Professor Kessler sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. The name landed like a dropped chandelier, loud, shocking, undeniable. William Dupree. A name that didn't just command respect, it cast shadows. The legendary violinist had redefined interpretation of 20th century classical repertoire. His playing was bold, defiant, emotional to the point of rawness. But more than that, he had been elusive. In the last 5 years of his life, Dupree had vanished from the public eye, retreating to a remote cabin in Vermont after a stroke had forced his retirement. Rumors had swirled that he'd been training a secret protege, someone worthy of his legacy. But no one could confirm it. Until now. Dr. Wexler leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "You studied with Maestro Dupree, personally?" Amara nodded. "For 3 years. Until he passed." The room was dead silent again. Not with contempt this time, but reverence. For a moment, Professor Kessler's expression faltered. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Brandon Langston, once so smug in his seat, now looked pale. His confident posture had collapsed into a quiet slump. His friends, who had laughed the loudest just minutes earlier, suddenly found their shoes or the floor or the far wall very interesting. Kessler found her voice. "That piece you played, it was his arrangement, wasn't it?" "Yes," Amara replied simply. "He wrote it for a student he said the world would never be ready for." She glanced down at the violin in her hands, the cracked, dusty loner, and gently handed it back to the assistant standing nearby. "I brought my own. I just didn't want to make a scene." Kessler stood. "Miss Sinclair, we would be honored to offer you the solo position for the International Virtuoso Showcase." Murmurs of agreement moved through the faculty seats. One judge began clapping again, as if trying to restart what should have been a triumphal moment. But Amara didn't smile. She didn't move. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I won't be accepting the solo." The words landed like a second thunderclap. Brandon looked up sharply, as if hoping he'd misheard. Professor Kessler frowned. "I beg your pardon?" "The solo," Amara repeated. "I'm not here for that." The silence was now taut with confusion. She looked out across the sea of stunned faces. "I came to honor my teacher. Maestro Dupree gave me everything when I had nothing. He taught me that music isn't just about performance, it's about purpose. And today, I want to ask this conservatory to start a scholarship in his name." Whispers began again, but they were different now, curious, cautious. Amara continued, voice steady. "There are students out there, students just like me, who love music but never get within a mile of a place like this. Not because they lack talent, but because they lack money, access, privilege. I'm asking Belhus to open its doors. Not just its ears." Kessler's expression hardened slightly and used to being put on the defensive. "A scholarship fund is a noble idea, Miss Sinclair. But these matters take time. Budget, approval, committees, then start the conversation today," Amara said gently. "Name it after Maestro Dupree. Fund it through a portion of showcase profits. I don't want a solo. I want a door." Her words echoed louder than her music had. Across the room, students looked at each other, not with the sneers of earlier, but with something closer to reflection. For the first time, they were being shown that the spotlight could illuminate more than just one person, it could reveal a system. Dr. Wexler, visibly moved, nodded slowly. "We will take your proposal under serious consideration." Amara met his eyes. "Not for me. For whoever comes next." As she turned and walked off the stage, the audience remained seated. There was no roar of applause this time. Just a quiet wait. A collective reckoning. Professor Kessler sat down again, her hands folded tightly in her lap. her face unreadable. Brandon Langston didn't move. His jaw was clenched, his hands resting limp on his thighs. His humiliation was complete and earned. The whispers now were not about Amara's clothes, her shoes, or her silence. They were about her presence, her defiance, her refusal to perform for approval. In the hours that followed, the story of Amara's audition spread through Belhurst like wildfire. Faculty huddled in conference rooms. Students replayed every note in their minds. Some tried to justify their earlier laughter, others tried to forget it. But none could deny what they'd seen. Something had shifted. The moment she spoke of the scholarship, Amara had changed the terms of success. It wasn't about standing at the center of the stage anymore. It was about who got to walk through the door in the first place. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and cast long shadows across the conservatory's stone courtyard, a few students lingered under the archways, still talking about the girl from Detroit who came in with nothing but a flannel-wrapped violin and left with the whole room watching. One whispered, "She turned down the solo." Another added, "She played like the world was ending." But the last voice said it best, quiet and reverent, "She didn't just play. She made them listen." And that, more than any applause, was the legacy she'd begun. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the corridors of Belhurst Conservatory began to hum, not with music, but with murmurs. Amara Sinclair's name, once unknown, now slipped into every whispered conversation, hung in every rehearsal room like a ghost note. The girl who had silenced a hall full of skeptics, then turned down the most coveted opportunity of the year, had left behind more than stunned applause. She had left behind a challenge. Her performance was no longer the headline. Her proposal was. Faculty meetings were convened with unusual urgency, and by the afternoon, an emergency session had been called. In that echoing boardroom lined with mahogany paneling and portraits of long-dead founders, the directors of Belhurst gathered around a polished oval table to debate something this institution had never truly prioritized: access. At the center of the discussion was Amara's quiet request, the William Dupree Scholarship Fund. Most had expected her to disappear after the audition, to be content with the respect she'd earned. Instead, she'd upended the system. 1 week later, it was official. The William Dupree Fellowship would offer full scholarships to underprivileged but gifted students in music performance, composition, and theory. The announcement came with no press conference, no gala, no string quartet playing Vivaldi in the background. Just a notice pinned to the bulletin board in the main hall. But it was enough. Students paused mid-stride to read it. Some blinked twice. Others stared. And those who had laughed loudest the week before now read in silence. The culture at Belhurst didn't change overnight, but it shifted. A seam had split, just wide enough for sunlight, and perhaps, someday, justice, to slip through. Meanwhile, Amara kept her distance from the commotion she had caused. She attended classes quietly, practiced in back rooms, and declined every interview request that came her way. She didn't want her face in a glossy program. She didn't want her story carved into headlines. She hadn't come to be seen. She had come to make something seen. Still, the campus couldn't look away. Some students approached her awkwardly in the hallways, asking about Maestro Dupree or apologizing without quite knowing why. Others avoided her entirely, unsure of how to reconcile their past cruelty with the grace she had shown them. One of those avoiding her was Brandon Langston. His world had unraveled quickly. The moment the scholarship news went public, complaints about his conduct poured in, some from witnesses, others from students emboldened by Amara's courage. Within days, the disciplinary board summoned him. Professor Kessler, who had once chuckled at his jokes, now stared at him stone-faced as the dean read the board's findings. Brandon had humiliated a peer in front of an audience. He had violated the school's code of conduct on ethics and inclusivity. The punishment, a semester suspension, loss of leadership roles, and a public apology required before reinstatement. The hearing room was silent when the verdict was delivered. Brandon didn't argue. For the first time, the boy who had filled rooms with his arrogance had nothing to say. As he walked out, shoulders heavy, his future dimmed by his own cruelty, the same students who once orbited him now drifted away. A golden boy, tarnished. Professor Vivian Kessler did not escape scrutiny either. Her recorded remarks, whispers caught on the auditorium's backup microphones, surfaced during the review. Bold of her to think that dress belongs under stage lights. It was played back during the faculty session. The silence that followed was deafening. The professor, known for poise and power, stood with trembling fingers as she issued a written apology, later read aloud at the weekly student assembly. She acknowledged her role in fostering exclusion. She praised Amara's performance and integrity. She called the moment a wake-up call. But the students didn't forget how easily she had laughed. Respect is earned in silence as much as in speech, and Kessler's silence during Amara's humiliation still echoed louder than her apology. Others, however, found ways to change. One evening, as Amara packed her sheet music into her backpack outside the practice rooms, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see a first-year student, Maya Rhodes, clutching a music folder to her chest. Maya's eyes were wide, hesitant, and filled with something more complicated than admiration. "Hi," she said softly. Amara smiled, but said nothing, waiting. Maya's words came slowly. "I was there. At the audition. I didn't say anything, but I heard it all. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop them either." Her voice faltered. "I'm sorry." Amara looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded gently. "You're here now. That's what matters." Maya exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath since that day. "You changed something. Everyone's talking about the scholarship. About Dupree. About you." Amara's smile was soft, but firm. "I didn't do it for them," she said. "I did it for him, and for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong." Later that night, as she walked across the quad under a canopy of quiet stars, another voice carried behind her. "She doesn't need the spotlight. She is the light." Amara didn't turn around. She didn't need to know who said it. The comment wasn't for her, it was for the world she had cracked open. For the silence she had broken. She walked on, her violin case secure at her side, her head lifted, not in pride, but in purpose. Her name might never shine in neon above a concert hall. She might never grace the cover of Classical Monthly. But in every young student who would now get a chance to walk through Belhust's doors, shoes scuffed, shirt wrinkled, soul burning with music, Amara Sinclair would live on. Not as a prodigy. Not as a performer. But as the reason someone else dared to believe they belonged. And in the end, that was the most enduring performance of all. When I wrote the story of Amara Sinclair, I wanted to do more than entertain. I wanted to hold up a mirror to the quiet, everyday battles fought by those who are overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel invisible simply because they don't fit the mold. Amara walked into that grand hall not to prove herself to anyone, but to honor someone who believed in her when the world did not. And in doing so, she changed everything, not with anger, not with revenge, but with excellence, grace, and purpose. The lesson here is not just about music. It's about value, how we see others, and how we often judge without understanding. Amara's story reminds us that true greatness is not always loud. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, wrapped in flannel cloth, wearing worn shoes, but carrying a spirit that can shake the walls of the highest institutions. To the student who feels out of place, to the artist who can't afford the right tools, to the dreamer who's been laughed at or dismissed, don't shrink to fit their expectations. Your worth isn't measured by your wardrobe, your zip code, or your pedigree. It's measured by your passion, your persistence, and your refusal to let mockery drown out your music, whatever form that music takes in your life. And to those in positions of power or privilege, your influence can open doors or slam them shut. Choose to be the one who listens before judging, who lifts up instead of tearing down. A simple act of acknowledgement, a single moment of grace, can be the spark that lights a generation. Here at US Edifying Stories, we're not just telling stories, we're building bridges. Stories like Amara's aren't fiction for many, they're reflections of real challenges faced in schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods across America. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to carry its message with you, see the unseen, hear the unheard, and believe in the quiet power of purpose. Thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for listening to a story that needed to be told. And if it inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to US Edifying Stories. You never know who else might need to be reminded, she doesn't need the spotlight. She is the light. And maybe, so are you.